From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. U.S. President Donald Trump continues to face outrage over his policy of separating immigrant children from their parents at the U.S. Mexico border. The president was briefly confronted by protesters and House Democrats following a meeting with Republican lawmakers in Capitol Hill. Protests have been growing in the United States as well as worldwide against Trump's zero-tolerance policy towards immigrants. Protesters from Texas, New York, and Philadelphia took to the streets to voice their concerns about the mistreatment of innocent children by his administration. Nationwide protests against it are planned for June 30th.
Shame on you! While you're there, make a donation!
You know, I just every time I think this administration isn't going to sink any lower, it does, and this is one of those things that hits home. I have 2 young kids. I heard those videos and I saw those photos, and I just imagined my own children being ripped away from me.
An enraged human rights activist in Washington confronted Kirstjen Nielsen, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Secretary, who chose a Mexican restaurant to have dinner on the day that the videos and audios of detained Central American children were released.
Nielsen, how dare you spend your evening here eating dinner as you're complicit in the separation and deportation of over 10,000 children separated from their parents? How can you enjoy a Mexican dinner as you're deporting and imprisoning tens of thousands of people who come here seeking asylum in the United States? We call on you to end family separation and
The Mexican Foreign Minister Luis Videgaray also issued a statement saying he considers the events unfolding at the border utterly cruel and inhumane.
The government of Mexico makes a call to the international community to speak out on this situation, which is unacceptable. We call on the government of the United States to allow and facilitate daily communication between parents and children. We know of many cases in which parents simply cannot speak to their children, and of course, very painful cases in which children are not allowed to communicate with their parents.
We spoke with Dr. Evelyn Encalada Gres, a migrant rights activist, about her reaction on those clips of the separated children. Let's listen to her.
Overall, I just saw this state violence that has had many faces throughout many decades throughout the region with our relationship to the United States, and the way that also the problems that people are fleeing from, children, their mothers and their fathers from Central America, and as far as also Brazil, a lot of them are U.S.-made problems, with the United States interfering in Latin America for several decades and aborting many social reforms that people are just having to escape from right now.
The United States officially withdrew from the United Nations Human Rights Council on Tuesday, accusing the Council of being biased, hypercritical, and self-serving. The exit marks the latest U.S. departure from multinational organizations and treaties. The country has pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, the UN Global Compact on Migration, the UN Culture and Education body UNESCO, as well as the Iran nuclear deal. The UN said it regrets the move. June 20th is World Refugee Day. Currently, over 68 million people across the world have been forcibly displaced by conflicts or internal persecution. According to figures of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, a person was displaced every 2 seconds in 2017. Conflicts in South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo and the exodus of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar brought the total number of forced displacements to a record of 68.5 million people. The UN highlights that 85% of refugees come from developing countries. This figure dismantles the idea that the refugee crisis has affected mostly the countries in the global north. Latin America has also suffered mass displacement. Colombia is one of the most affected countries in the region. Over 7 million people have been displaced by the internal conflict. More than 300,000 Colombians left the country, fleeing from violence between the armed forces, guerrillas, and paramilitary groups. Violent crime in Central America has boosted the number of refugees from that region 16 times since 2011. The economic blockade and the political crisis in Venezuela has meant that the country, traditionally a home for refugees, has seen tens of thousands leave to find work in other parts of Latin America. Violence flared again in Nicaragua on Tuesday after the opposition suspended its participation in the talks with the government. Armed opposition groups manned barricades in the city of Masaya and fired homemade weapons as the security forces and government supporters tried to break the siege of a police station. Bursts of gunfire resounded in 3 central neighborhoods. There were reports of several people killed. Opposition groups demand that President Daniel Ortega invites the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the European Union to oversee the talks in order to resume the dialogue. Official numbers have been released by the Truth, Justice and Peace Commission, detailing 173 deaths, which have occurred since the beginning of the anti-government protests on April 18. The Commission condemned the violence as different sectors of society urged the parties to get back to the dialogue table. Nicaragua's Minister for Domestic Policies talked to Democracy Now! About the unprecedented opposition violence in his country and the grave bias in international reporting about the situation.
Nicaragua is a polarized society, and there's been violence in the last 2 months on both sides. And what we've seen lately is a wave of violence never seen before in Nicaragua, of kidnappings, of state institutions destroyed, mayor's offices burned down, torture, intimidation, persecution. And there's been a tremendous slant in the news because this is a media war also, and it's a social media war. It's straight out of Gene Sharp's handbook of how to destabilize governments that's been used several times. And I'm not the only one saying this. Gene Sharp's handbook has been recommended by leaders of this movement. You can find that on the internet. And false news, black propaganda is part of the game. And there's no balance in this. It's all one-sided. So
Our correspondent in Managua, María José Díaz, brings us more.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Es un gusto saludarlos.
On Monday, official sources said that the opposition left the 3 working tables at the National Dialogue. They also declined to stop the demonstrators that are causing violence and killing across the country. Tuesday was another day scheduled for dialogue. However, the so-called Civic Alliance for Justice and Democracy said it would participate in the dialogue table if the government invites the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the European Union. The Commission for Peace, Truth and Justice said it is deeply concerned about the painful and disgusting events occurred last weekend. It made a call for the Nicaraguans to save the conflict through dialogue and said this is the only possible way to put an end to the current crisis. The Commission for Peace, Truth and Justice said that so far the crisis has provoked 173 killings since April 18th. Members of the National Students' Union in Nicaragua also made a call to put an end to violence and to search for peace. They rejected hate, kidnappings, torture, human rights violence, and the killing of Nicaraguans. Members of the trade unions, who are also participating in the dialogue table, said that the parties should resume talks as soon as possible to bring back stability to the Nicaraguan people.
That was María José Díaz from Managua. We'll take a short break now, but join us again after this video from our multimedia team. Welcome back. In Venezuela, Diosdado Cabello has been elected as the new president of the National Constituent Assembly. Cabello is replacing Delcy Rodriguez, who is now executive vice president, elected unanimously. Hundreds of people came to see the appointment of Cabello as the session was shown on television as well as on giant screens outside the building in Caracas. The Supreme Court in Brazil absolved Senator and President of the Workers' Party, Gleisi Hoffmann, on charges of alleged corruption. The 5 Supreme Court members unanimously dismissed the accusations that linked Hoffmann to the scandals around the state-owned oil company Petrobras. Prosecutors accused Hoffmann and her husband of receiving $568,000 for a campaign slush fund. The head of the Workers' Party always defended her innocence and said the process was part of a political persecution. Colombia's President-elect Iván Duque said that he will demand the National Liberation Army, or ELN, to cease all of its activities to continue with the peace talks. During his electoral campaign, Duque said that former guerrilla members should go to jail despite any agreement. The upcoming president also said he wants the peace accord signed with the FARC in 2016 to be modified, but he promised he will not erase it. The ELN and the Colombian government are currently holding peace talks in Havana, Cuba.
The only way to build a process of peace that gives Colombian people confidence must promote the suspension of all criminal activities. We have always said that we are not going to tear down the agreements of peace with the FARC. And what we have said is that the approach to modifications will be made on the basis of a peace that unites Colombia, because we can't remain divided as a country between friends and enemies of peace.
Meanwhile, the Senate has postponed the vote on the bill for the special jurisdiction for peace requested by President-elect Duque. Following the Senate's decision, current President Juan Manuel Santos called for an extraordinary session in Congress to extend the debate until the Senate makes a move. The jurisdiction for peace is a mechanism of transitional justice created after the peace agreement to judge militants linked to the country's internal conflict.
Members of the Democratic Center Party expressed their opinions regarding the call made by Pablo Beltrán, chief negotiator of the ELN, to continue the dialogue with the government of Iván Duque.
We hope to continue our talks with the new government and for the peace agreements to be respected.
We can't allow the ELN to do whatever they want as they sit at a negotiation table, asking for even more things than the FARC did.
For analysts, peace talks are in danger following Iván Duque's election. Regardless of the peaceful intentions of the guerrilla group.
This is terrible for peace. We're moving backwards, and what's worse is that they will throw away an entire process that took a lot of work and years to develop. The ELN is at its best point in terms of negotiations with the government.
The newly elected president, as well as Álvaro Uribe supporters, have expressed their rejection of the peace agreements and the special jurisdiction for peace.
We are against that jurisdiction. We consider it only useful for the FARC and criminal guerrillas, not for civilians and the national armed forces.
Senators say that in spite of what the right-wing groups think, the jurisdiction should be enforced to defend peace.
8 million Colombians voted for continued peace. We will mobilize to protect and enforce the peace agreements. We think that this country must not go backwards after all the lives that have already been saved.
Meanwhile, President Juan Manuel Santos stated that if the special jurisdiction for peace is not approved on Wednesday, he will call for an extraordinary session of Congress.
Public outrage is growing against Mauricio Macri's agreement with the International Monetary Fund in Argentina. The agreed measures are due to start this week.
The agreement with the IMF made the social protests even worse. People arrived outside the central bank to express their rejection. They even burned flags of the United States empire. The increase of neoliberal policies applied by the government creates each time more hunger and misery among the people.
There is total rejection for the agreement signed with the IMF. The adjustment policies bring hunger to the people. We know that what's coming next is going to be terrible.
This only means misery, hunger, the end of production, national industry, and work. We lived in the 90s and now it's going to be worse.
The $50 billion credit granted by the IMF comes during a serious economic crisis in the country and takes effect this week with the first advance of $15 billion. The agreement will follow a program that demands deep structural adjustments.
The IMF is working along with the government to apply these kinds of policies. We are now under the yoke of the international economic system, and we are starting a process of the economic destruction of each country in the region.
Economic uncertainty is having consequences in different provinces. Many are already bankrupt and can't pay workers' salaries.
Our people are living in misery. Workers are poor now. Salaries are not enough to face inflation, and unions are being abolished. We must keep fighting because we can't ask the government to reconsider things. The government is creating poverty. We can only keep on fighting.
The IMF deals seem to be taking Argentina back to a crisis just like the one of 2001. People are not happy and workers are preparing a general strike for next Monday, the 25th of June. They hope it will take its toll on Mauricio Macri's government.
In Paraguay, the Haiti indigenous people protested on Tuesday against an eviction from their lands located in the western department of Canindeyú. Demonstrators gathered outside of Congress in the capital city of Asunción. They wore chains around their necks to symbolize the oppression they say the community is suffering. The Haiti were expelled from their lands where they have been living for decades by judicial orders. The government of Barbados has canceled the visa requirement for Haitian nationals entering the country. The Home Affairs Minister Edmund Hinkson said that Haiti, being a member of the Caribbean community since 2002, should be treated equally and that this unfair practice must stop at once. He added that his ministry is in the process of preparing a white paper on immigration with a view to deepening the integration movement and Haiti's relationship with the rest of the region.
If Haiti is a member of CARICOM and the Treaty of Chaguaramas speaks towards non-discrimination and equal treatment, how can you have put on visa requirements on Haitians? I mean, why do we do this to our own people?
In the first match of the day at the Russia World Cup, Portugal beat Morocco 1-0. Striker Cristiano Ronaldo scored the first and only goal of the match in the 4th minute, putting Portugal at the top of Group B. Uruguay has just scored 23 minutes into the game against Saudi Arabia. Luis Suarez was the scorer. And later, Spain will try to obtain its first victory against Iran. Brazilian supporters are among the largest group of fans represented at the World Cup, but Mexico could increase its presence in the coming days after its team beat Germany in the first match.
Mexico is among the 4 Latin American countries with the highest number of bought tickets for the 2018 Russia World Cup. According to FIFA, the leading country is Brazil, with 65,000 tickets. However, the victory of Mexico against Germany would motivate an increase in the number of Mexican fans' arrivals.
It's a tournament that Latin America is going to win. The World Cup is going to be Mexican. All Latin Americans will see it.
Mexico has a great team, but we will beat them. If the final is Brazil-Mexico, we will win it.
Mexico football fans bought 40,000 tickets out of the more than 200,000 sold in Latin America. Russian authorities think that the presence of Mexican fans will grow, especially after its win 1-0 against Germany.
We made history because we beat the world champion, and now we're going for this World Cup.
Mexico won this one deservedly, but Germany is still in this. Only the first game of the group, guys. Easy. Calm down. Calm down. It's still early.
It was a good game. Mexico made a really good performance. So yeah, this time it was better. Germany maybe will come as a second out of this group, and then perhaps we'll meet again in semi-final or wherever. Let's see.
The streets and squares of Moscow were filled with Mexican colors. Latin American and Russian fans celebrated the victory.
It was the best game ever. I don't have words to describe what happened. It was a difficult game, but we won, and that's what matters.
Great game, great victory. I really enjoy it.
Experts assure that the debut of Mexico's national team ended the winning streak of the current champions. The Germans hadn't lost in their first game since the World Cup played in Italy in 1990.
We'll take one last short break, but join us again after another video from our multimedia team. Thank you for joining us again. Dozens of protesters gathered outside the Ecuadorian embassy in London to mark the 6th anniversary since WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange was given political asylum there. Protesters demanded the release of Assange and said providing information is not a crime. The 46-year-old entered the embassy evading an arrest over sexual assault charges by the Swedish government, which were later dropped. But he still faces espionage charges and a criminal investigation by the U.S. government over the release of thousands of classified documents. Now let's take a look at other stories making headlines around the world.
More than 1,000 families in the north of Cameroon have received emergency aid from the Red Cross after fleeing the violence of the Islamic group Boko Haram. The international organization gave the displaced groups seeds and fertilizers to strengthen their autonomy. The families were also placed in host homes. Victims said they hope to return home soon to cultivate their lands. The European Union Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker sharply criticized U.S. President Donald Trump, accusing him of meddling in German politics. Juncker's comments came a day after Trump tweeted that people of Germany were turning against their leadership because of loose immigration policies. Juncker added Trump may govern the United States, but not Europe.
It is not the American president's job to speculate on whether the German population will be marching on the Chancellery to replace Mrs. Angela Merkel. She won't be replaced by Mr. Trump. If she is replaced at all, which will not be desirable, it will be by German voters.
Canada could become the first G7 country to legalize the use of recreational cannabis, as the bill was approved in Parliament earlier this week. The legislation must now pass the Senate and receive royal assent by the Governor General before becoming law, likely in September. The Senate could still delay its implementation, but not block it.
And before we go, let me remind you that you can catch our special World Cup program with Argentina football star Diego Armando Maradona. De la mano del 10, the World Cup according to Maradona. It will air only on Telesur every night throughout the World Cup in Russia. These are the times to watch it, so don't miss out. And with that, we come to the end of this news brief. But these and other stories, as you know, you can find on our website, telesurtv.net/English. And be sure to also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.